otherwise.
Welcome to FCPA Flash, the official podcast of FCPA Professor and moderated by Professor Mike Koehler. FCPA Professor is the leading source of daily FCPA news and commentary and the most authoritative source for those seeking to understand and apply the FCPA. To learn how FCPA Professor can elevate your FCPA knowledge, please visit www.fcpaprofessor.com. FCPA Flash is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group manages your integrity and risk profile, turning compliance into a competitive advantage. The Red Flag Group assists companies in developing and maintaining efficient and effective corporate governance and compliance programs and has a proven track record in providing integrity due diligence investigations in 194 countries.
Thank you for listening to the FCPA Flash podcast. This is Professor Mike Koehler, and I invite you to my next FCPA Institute in Nashville on May 4th through the 5th. To learn more about the two-day FCPA Institute and how it has elevated the FCPA knowledge and practical skills of a diverse group of professionals, please visit fcpaprofessor.com and click on the FCPA Institute page. Welcome to FCPA Flash. This is Professor Mike Koehler, and in today's episode, I'm pleased to be joined by Sherbir Panag. He's the founding partner of the law offices of Panag and Babu and manages the firm's office in New Delhi, India. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Mike. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Today we are going to be talking about some of the FCPA and related compliance challenges of doing business in India. And I should mention that Mr. Panag has a wealth of experience advising foreign companies on Indian anti-corruption laws and challenges associated with the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the U.K. Bribery Act, and other foreign laws dealing with the bribery of foreign public officials in India. And the first question I have for you, Sherbir, is it's often said in many countries, and including India, that it's not possible to do business in India without paying bribes. What's your response to that suggestion?
Well, the easy part of the answer there is that yes, it is possible to do business in India without paying bribes. Is it easy? No. But with a steadfast strategy and a good deal of with enormous amounts of commitment rather, and building the right capacity towards compliance, it would be possible. I would want to add that India shouldn't be painted with the same brush that one gets used to when considering investment in certain countries in the African subcontinent or in Eastern Europe, for that matter, where the political systems are much weaker. We are a democracy at the end of the day. We don't function perfectly, but very few democracies function perfectly. And more than that, we have a reasonable semblance of the rule of law. So, in a nutshell, I would say that it's no easy task, but it's definitely possible.
What are some of the greatest challenges for either U.S. companies or foreign companies, for that matter, subject to the FCPA and other anti-bribery laws, doing business in India, recognizing that companies can become the subject of scrutiny for any number of reasons? Just on my read of many of the FCPA enforcement actions concerning conduct in India, it seems to be licensing and permitting issues. Would you agree that that's one of the greater risk? And if so, why is it such a big risk?
Yes, Mike, I think you're absolutely right. You've identified one of the key risk areas is permissions, approvals, licenses, and that's partly because of what in India we typically call the license Raj, or the rule of licenses. The reason being that this part of it is the colonial past that we're burdened with, and part of it is that we never, that as successive lawmaking has failed to address this issue, and most companies and businesses in general are burdened with getting several licenses and permits. For example, I recall reading that a food and beverage company setting up a restaurant in Mumbai needed something close to 46 licenses in order to be completely compliant with the law and to set up. And as a result of the wide discretion that is available to the grant of these licenses and the potential for misuse, abuse there, that becomes a risk, that becomes a significant bribery avenue. So that's pretty much where the risk gets collated. But I would add that there's no rocket science to figuring out how many licenses, approvals, permissions a company actually needs. And very few companies, in my view, including foreign multinational companies, actually go the extra mile to determine what permissions, approvals, licenses they actually need for a specific factory and where they are setting up. So what ends up happening is a term that I use fairly often, and I call it bribery panic, which is that by virtue of the limited information that we don't know what needs to be done, the company ends up bribing for lack of better options. So, for example, a company setting up an industrial unit on agricultural land, which is not meant for setting up an industry, is going to be virtually bribing for the rest of its existence at that location. They're going to have to bribe to get a water connection there because, again, you're running a factory on agricultural land. You need to bribe to get electricity to the plant because, again, you're running a factory on agricultural land. And just a fair amount of due diligence would have allowed the company to know how to address this issue. Similarly, when the renewal of a permission hypothetically is due on, let's say the 31st of March, but the company wakes up on the 27th of March and then realizes that, if we don't get this permission or we don't get this renewal in place, we're going to be in significant trouble. And with 4 days to go, they have virtually pushed themselves to the verge of having to bribe to ensure that business operations commence. So the avenue for bribery exists, which gets exploited as a result of the company not preparing itself adequately for the challenge at hand. So that's another example of it. The third and most common example that I end up finding is that the lack of capacity within the organizations to address these issues. I find very few foreign multinational companies, empirically speaking, I'm not talking about the larger Fortune 100s, but I would say that even the Fortune 500 companies in India don't have a single legal resource in-house. So the process of getting the permissions, approvals, licenses falls on somebody either in human resources or in administration who doesn't have the experience or the capacity to even to fill a form correctly, to plan in advance to get, let's say there's a foreign director on the board, get a board resolution signed, get something notarized from a consulate outside, get it consularized, get the documents in order. If your paperwork is in order, getting these permissions, approvals, or licenses becomes much, much, much easier.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on a couple of points there. What was it, 42 or 46 licenses you said to open up a restaurant in Mumbai? Yeah. And, for listeners' benefit, it's important to realize that at the end of the day, FCPA or UK Bribery Act or whatever risk arises because a business person is in contact with a foreign official. It's all about contacts with foreign officials. And if you have 42 points of contact just to open up a restaurant, that's 42 potential transactions that could be subject to scrutiny under anti-bribery laws. So at the end of the day, a lot of times the reasons FCPA enforcement actions happen is because of the bureaucracy that foreign countries have, and well-intentioned companies sometimes find themselves in the midst of that bureaucracy. Imagine if the licenses needed were only 20. Well, that would be cutting in half the points of contact. Are there any efforts in India purely for, domestic reasons to cut down on this level of bureaucracy and cut down on the level of licenses and permits needed? We understand why, the government would want some oversight responsibility over a restaurant, for instance, just from a health and safety standpoint. But any efforts domestically to address this issue?
Yes, there are ongoing efforts, and we've got a good number of, for example, utility services which have gone online, and for example, you can pay electricity bills online, water connection bills online, there are permissions, taxes can be paid online. So there are adequate efforts there. Mike, I'd slightly differ with the characterization with regards to the number of licenses. There are significant or equal number of licenses that the foreign companies, probably not to the extent that we just discussed, but significant in number, that these companies have to seek when they are in for example, in the United States or the United Kingdom or in Germany. Health and safety or fire safety standards will be higher, but it's a different approach. Somehow, when subsidiaries are getting established in foreign countries, what ends up happening is that the same process isn't followed. For example, you wouldn't have HR filing fire safety permissions in the United States, which somehow ends up happening in India, or you wouldn't have the administrative officer of the company being responsible for labor compliances, which somehow ends up happening in India. So it's really putting the wrong person on the wrong job that also creates the avenue, and that I would virtually pump the table and say this, that in a majority of the investigations that I've conducted for U.S. companies or companies that are governed by FCPA or similar laws, I find a significant mismatch in capacity. We aren't going beyond text, paper compliance to actually ensure that a compliance program gets, for example, in the Indian context, gets Indianized to respond to the risks that exist in India.
So you also mentioned the spot-on point that companies doing business in India obviously need to be proactive and recognize the regulatory landscape well in advance, so they don't experience an episode of what you called this bribery panic. Going back to the example you used of building a manufacturing facility on agriculture land, or a similar example like that, are you suggesting then that if the company knew, a couple months in advance and was proactive in dealing with that there would not be bribes demanded in connection?
Absolutely. I think I could say that the bribe would not be demanded, but you would be in a far better position to fight the challenge. And we have reason. Our prosecution numbers aren't ideal, but they are there. And if a foreign company whose own house is in order goes and complains about an issue, cognizance will be taken. We have the police. Even on Twitter, I've seen companies, and I've filed complaints for companies using social media, either over WhatsApp or the call center lines, or even over Twitter for companies facing such issues, and action has been taken. So, but the issue is, if your own house is not in order, it becomes very difficult for a company to speak up. So, I think the key takeaway here is plan in advance. Factor in the time that it's likely to take to navigate this process. Include that into your opportunity cost. And thereafter, you A, have already reduced the exposure, and B, in the unlikely event that a bribe demand is still made, you're in a much better position to fight it. And there is no one public servant or one in the context of permissions, approvals, licenses in the context of routine business exercises that can shut down your company in India, unlike certain other countries in other parts of the world. And our higher judiciary is fairly well respected. You can always challenge this through the writ jurisdiction. So we aren't in one of those impossible situations where you either pay a bribe or you get a gun to your head. Yes, there are instances where those do happen, and I wouldn't deny them. But those for a multinational company that's operating within reasonable and legal bounds in India, it's highly unlikely that they would face a situation such as that.
No, and that's sound advice to be proactive there, and you can imagine a corrupt official making a bribe demand has more leverage over a company that is in panic mode because of the failure to properly plan. So that's good, sound, practical advice for companies navigating the Indian marketplace. You mentioned on occasion you have reported via social media or other means some corrupt foreign officials that your clients may have encountered. Can you perhaps elaborate a little bit more on how that process might work and whether there was any satisfactory and timely resolution of that benefited your clients?
Yes, on multiple occasions we've had satisfactory resolution to that effect. We've had instances where arrests have been made, and ending the investigation, the company's assessment was moved to another circle. For example, within a city like, for example, Mumbai, if you are supposed to go to A labor, you fall within the circle of A labor inspector who demanded a bribe. During the course of the investigation, they would transfer you to another sector and ensure that and the reputation that you end up creating in a company that follows the book and has already complained about one instance pretty much carries forward, and you don't face that issue somewhere else. So we've seen several instances like this, and we've also had instances where clients have roped me in at the time at which the demand was made, and we've virtually gone and said we're going to report the issue, and we have filed complaints. And in my experience, especially when companies are operating within industrial zones where other foreign companies are, or in special economic zones, we've virtually seen no backlash to any of these complaints. We have taken, while I always recommend that we take adequate precautions and we document aggressively and prepare for worse, but in my experience we've seen no backlash.
Well, thanks for those examples. Now, you also mentioned Indianizing compliance programs, FCPA compliance programs. Can you provide a little bit more detail for the benefit of listeners as to how they might do that?
Yeah. Well, I think first, the policy framework perspective, it's important to get in aspects of Indian law where Indian law is actually more specific than the FCPA. For example, the definition of a foreign official under the FCPA always goes back and forth with what it is, and there's very little jurisprudence there. Versus the Indian anti-corruption law very exhaustively defines a public government official, which would also be congruent with what the FCPA needs. So it's better in the Indian context to use our definition and get the point clearly across. Similarly, when it comes to gifts and hospitality, again, the Department of Justice and the SEC and their guidance have used generic terms that such gifts and hospitality must be reasonable, must be commensurate to cultural values, etc. Versus Indian laws governing public servants very clearly define the limits at what of the gifts that gifts or hospitality that can be extended to them and what can't be extended to them. So that comes on the high level policy at a high level policy overview. On a slightly more nuanced basis, I would recommend forms such as your due diligence questionnaires start factoring in peculiarities of the Indian system. I typically find companies have their forms, their due diligence forms that say name of company, but most third parties in India would be proprietorships or individuals. And the information that you really want is on the individual or the business principle and not so much on the company, because there'd be very little there. And then similarly, when it comes to due diligence is a major challenge, and I would virtually, bank my professional reputation on any international company that tells me that they can do robust due diligence in India. It's virtually not possible to have the level of diligence that one would expect to do, or what law enforcement expects in the United States to have that replicated in India. We don't have a national criminal database. It's very difficult to get criminal antecedent checks. And in the event that somebody is genuinely keen to get them, it could be very expensive. So it's important to create a risk matrix and figure out where does the company spend more on diligence, where does it spend less. Thereafter, when it comes to things like permissions, approvals, licenses, I think it's the simpler things that the company needs to do. Ensure that it has a reasonable resource within the company. Or if it doesn't, it outsources and finds a good resource, which could be in the form of a law firm, it could be in the form of an accounting firm, or a respectable third-party consultant, and not just chasing any agent who knocks on their door first. And then doing the simple things, Mike. It's create a simple spreadsheet, put in what the permission is, when is it due, who's responsible for it, how long is it likely to take, what are the documents required. The thing about the bureaucracy is that a bureaucracy can't create magical documents. So the number of documents you need to submit for a permission or an approval or a license are fairly easy to determine. And once so determined, yes, there could be variations, there could be additional requirements, but the general sense of them is typically similar. So make the effort to invest in that, build your capacity to respond, and that will help the company avoid avenues of bribery. I think at a very high level, the strategy has to be avoiding avenues, avoiding touch points. If a utility bill can be paid online, there's no point sending someone to pay it. If similarly a permission or a tax or a duty can be paid online, there's no point sending someone to the government department to pay it. So a lot of it is really the simple stuff, but it requires effort. If the assumption that the company draws is that we have a compliance program that we've rolled out across the world, it covers in the 6 principles that the Ministry of Justice has specified for the UK Bribery Act, or it conforms broadly to DOJ guidance. That's not going to work in India. I've found it pretty humorous. I was at a conference in Chicago last year, and somebody, one of the vendors selling a training program, FCPA training program, listed the languages and listed a language called Indian. I don't speak Indian, and I don't know any Indian national who speaks Indian, because there simply isn't a language called Indian. We have 22 recognized languages in India, and each of those languages are fairly different. If you have if a company has a facility in the south of India, their training needs to be in a different language versus what you'd be looking at doing in the north of India, or the west, or the east for that matter. Even within the southern states, the 4 southern states speak entirely different languages, and in certain cases our scripts are different. So as a key takeaway, I would say this investment to determine what is needed for an Indian compliance program is imperative, and if it's not happening, anything besides that is mere window dressing.
Well, thank you for sharing your perspectives with us today. To state the obvious, FCPA compliance is and related compliance is specific to the country we're talking about. And you have provided listeners some great practical points to best manage and mitigate risk in the Indian market. So thanks for joining us today. Again, the guest has been Sherbir Panag. He's the founding partner of the law offices of Panag and Babu and manages the firm's New Delhi office. And if any listeners run into compliance issues in India or are setting up an operation in India, I think you'd be well served to give Mr. Panag a call. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you so much.